Hey everybody. So as Paul said, my name is Scott Richmond. I was an ASA from 2008 to 2014, which I didn't think was that long ago, but I probably recognize about 2 people in the room, so apparently it was. But I heard, talking to Ivan how important it was to focus on training and training opportunities, and I had talked to Paul and Angelo Gallagher-Galliano about the work I'd done with Christina. So I just want to take a minute to introduce her to you guys. So this is Dr. Christina Marinakis. She actually is now with a company called Emergent Legal, which just started, was it a week ago? Yeah. She has her BS in bioscience psychology, her master's in clinical psychology, her JD and Psych D in clinical psychology. She actually graduated #1 in her class in her JD program as well. She's a licensed attorney in the state of Pennsylvania. She has over 20 years experience doing jury selection, jury trials, mock trials, focus groups, speaking to jurors after the fact. She's been described by some clients as best in the business at picking a jury. She's probably picked hundreds of juries at this point, in courtrooms across this country. I've actually worked with Christina on 2 different cases, well, probably 5 or 6 cases at this point, but 2 came to mind. I do a lot of civil litigation, a lot of talcum powder litigation. We had 2 cases where both cases they asked for literally $1 billion, and they're both defense verdicts very quickly, and I think a lot of that was attributable to Christina's work. As you guys probably saw from the advertisement Paul sent, she picked the jury in the Derek Chauvin trial, picked the jury for Vanessa Bryant, Kobe Bryant's wife, in the civil trial. She's been consulted on a number of high-profile cases, and Kyle Rittenhouse, Jazane Maxwell, Elizabeth Holmes, some other trials. She also has a number of publications, articles, books. She actually wrote a book on voir dire questions for civil and criminal cases. So without further ado, I'll turn it to Christina.
Thank you. You left out the most important fact, though. And that's that I was actually born here in Baltimore. Born in Baltimore, grew up in Highlandtown, Greek town. Family owns a restaurant there, Icaros. Go visit Icaros. Great place. And so I've lived in Baltimore really all my life. I do live out in Los Angeles now, but I maintain an apartment here on Light Street. So I am local, too. That's I think I'm the only jury consultant that actually is based in Maryland. So Maryland-based. Woo. All right. So thank you for the introduction, Scott. One thing I want to say, so he mentioned the company Emergent Legal, and doing the jury selection with Vanessa Bryant, we disagreed about one of the jurors to get rid of, and she said, I'll bet on you. I'm paying you, I'm going to bet on you. And she said one of the things that Kobe Bryant said was, if you're going to bet on somebody, bet on yourself. And so that quote, and having Vanessa tell me that, is one of the reasons why I decided to leave my company and start Immersion. So that's one of the reasons why we started a week ago, was because Vanessa gave me some kind words, and I heard from some other people. And so now we own our own business, and we've got a number of employees that have come over with me. So that's really exciting for this week. So here's my little plug. My 2-second plug is what we do is jury selections. We do focus groups. We do mock trials. It's pretty rare that we do them in criminal cases, but sometimes we have budgets to do that. We also do graphics development and trial technology, so hot seat operator. I know that you all don't have the luxury of having all those services all the time. If you ever do have something where you get a budget, we were given a big budget in the Derek Chauvin trial, or fairly decent sized budget. So we gave all of our time pro bono, but we were able to do focus groups and have a hot seat operator in that case. All right, so we really need to understand a little bit about people before we understand about jury selection. And there's something about people where we could see the same exact thing at the same time and yet come to different conclusions. Have you ever had that happen where you've had an argument with your spouse and afterwards you talk about what happened and you say, well, you said this. And they're like, I didn't say that, I said this. And each of you are very sure. And you each do have memories of the fight, but each memory is going to be different than the other person's memory because it's all about perception. And your perception has been shaped by your life experiences. Every experience that you've had since you were born is going to, and even your genetics, is going to shape how you view things. And so in a trial, each juror is going to be coming to the case with a lens, and they're going to view the evidence through a lens, and they're going to filter that evidence through the lens. And that lens has been crafted by their entire life experience. So the whole point of voir dire is to figure out the lens. Because if you can figure out the lens, you can figure out how the person's going to view the case. Now, in states where we get to ask a lot of questions in voir dire, like California, we can predict pretty much 10 out of 12 jurors which way they're going to vote. There's always some that surprise you. In Maryland, it's a lot harder because we don't get a whole lot of opportunity to know much about people, but you do the best that you can. And so it actually comes from a psychological principle known as confirmation bias. And it's this principle where every time we take in new information, we filter it. We tend to remember the things that we want to believe that support our arguments or our beliefs of the world, and we forget or discredit or even just not even remember that the things that don't fit. So sometimes when we do mock trials, you hear the jurors deliberate, and they'll come up with stuff that's like, nobody ever said that. And they come up with new evidence. Or they say, I wish I could have seen this. And it's like, we did show you that. But they just don't remember things because they take down notes of stuff that fits them and they don't listen to other stuff. So you just have to understand there's going to be some jurors that you will never be able to persuade because their lens has been clouded by bias so much that they just can't see things your way, ever. And so identifying those people, those couple of people who are just, no matter what the evidence is never going to side your way, is the whole point of voir dire. And that's so jurors are just going to filter that evidence. They do the same thing that we all do. Clients will ask me, who do we want on our jury? Men, women, young people, old people, what race? And I say that that's really misguided because demographics are the least predictive variable when it comes to whether a juror is going to be good for you or not. It's really the attitudes and opinions and beliefs that shape people and how their perspectives are. Now, unfortunately, judges will not always let you ask about attitudes, opinions, and beliefs, and sometimes they limit you to experiential questions. So we say that, attitudes and opinions tend to correlate with experiences. So let me give you an example. If the attitude you're trying to attach is, who believes that police officers treat black suspects unfairly? That's the attitude that you're trying to get at. And maybe the judge says, I'm not going to let you ask that question. But you can ask the question of, who here have you or anyone close to you been discriminated against by a police officer? Now, so that attitude is likely to correlate with that experience, but not always. It could not. And there could be other people that don't have that experience that have that attitude. But sometimes you have to ask the experience to try to get at the attitude if that's what you're limited. And then experiences will sometimes correlate with demographics. So certain demographics will have shared experiences. If you're a minority, you're likely to experience more discrimination. So that person is more likely to hold the opinion. And so there is a correlation there, but you certainly have people that don't fall in those demographics that have the same opinions. So we say really try to focus on, if you can focus your questions, try to ask about the attitudes and opinions first. That's the most important thing. And then if you can't get them, then you can start to ask about experiences. And the very last thing you should be looking at is demographics. But we do have generalized jury profiles for most cases, and this generally applies to most criminal cases, not every case, but just generally speaking. You will find that jurors that lean toward the defense in criminal cases tend to be more liberal than the conservative jurors. And I say liberal, I don't necessarily mean Democrat, because there's a lot of folks who are Democrat. It's more the people that are very far left, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren. Those are probably going to be your not great jurors for the prosecution. When you're looking at education, you may think sometimes, why we want smart jurors. Well, not always. And what's smart? You're going to have book smart and not have a high education. So when it comes to education, you don't really want to look at the level of education, it's the type of education. If you're a prosecutor, you would much rather have someone that is a high school educated mechanic who's very analytical than a PhD level in women's studies or humanities or psychology, right? It's the type of education that you're looking at, not the level. When it comes to professions, your bad jurors tend to be people in the helping professions. So it would be often anyone that's a lower level nurse, so like a CNA or a home caretaker. RNs and nurse practitioners can actually be very good defense jurors or very good prosecution jurors because they like to problem solve. But for criminal cases, it's those helping professionals, teachers sometimes, administrative assistants, even people that are in the service and hospitality industry, or anyone that's in the artistic industry. Jurors who tend to be defense jurors also tend to be idealistic. They talk about wanting to change the status quo. So you may see, they feel like, in civil cases, they may say things like, well, lawsuits are there because we need to improve products. We wouldn't have safety belts. We wouldn't have airbags if it wasn't for lawsuits. So in a criminal context, it might be the same sort of thing where people feel like these laws shouldn't be this way. This is old school laws that were written by, old white men 200 years ago. It shouldn't be like this anymore. And they're more likely to apply their own judgment than to stick completely to the facts and the evidence and the law. We also have something in psychology that we call locus of control. And that's just a psychobabble word for who do you think determines the outcome? And this is the most predictive factor in jury outcome in both civil and criminal cases. And it's this idea of there's a continuum of locus of control. There's people that have very high external locus. They feel like everything that happens to you is because of something in the environment. It's because of how society treated you, the resources that you had, the opportunities that you have. Anything that happens to you is bad luck or something else did it, right? And then on the other side, you have this high internal locus of control, and those are people who feel like everything that happens to you is because of something you did. Your choices determine the outcome. And then most people fall somewhere in between, right? So your absolutely worst jurors are going to be the people that are very far on this end of high external locus of control, because they will really make excuses for everybody, or they try to see, well, maybe that wasn't the case, maybe he believed this, and they will try to look for external forces of why that defendant is not responsible. On the flip side, what you want is the people over here that say, if you did it, then it's because you made a poor choice, because you didn't work hard enough, because you had drug problems, whatever it may be. So those tend to be really bad jurors. You also tend to have jurors that are defense jurors in cases also tend to be a little bit more health conscious. And I don't mean like they go to the gym a lot. I mean more like they don't eat gluten or red dye number 5, or they avoid saccharin and sweeteners. Just people who are very like wholesome granola type people. We have a lot of them in California. Those are probably not your greatest jurors in these cases. And then also just people who are entitled or complainers. Your typical Karen, if you've heard that term before, it's like that's a juror that is not somebody that you want on your case, because they can be a real wild card, and they could just be someone that feels like this isn't fair, and they will hang your jury. We call them contrarians. So somebody that's always going to play devil's advocate, and I've been on the defense side before in criminal cases too, and we're looking for those contrarians when we've had very clear DNA evidence that our client was there at the murder scene. We were able to find, contrarian to say, well, there's DNA transfer and all that, and maybe she didn't do it. So you don't want those contrarians on your jury if you're trying to get a unanimous verdict. And then lastly, they have the sense of like people need to help each other out. It takes a village to raise a child. When it comes to contractual disputes, they would say, seller be fair over buyer beware. So those people that just tend to be helpful-minded people. Those would all be people who are more likely to side in favor of the defense. Now, it's never a slam dunk. It's always case-specific, but it's a game of numbers and it's a game of statistics. The whole idea is you want to increase your chances of having a favorable verdict. So every little bit that you get, it helps you out a little bit. Now, on the flip side, you have your pro-prosecution jurors, which is pretty much everything opposite of what I just said. So it's usually your Republican or conservative jurors. I will give a word of caution, though. It used to be very easy to say all Republicans would side with the prosecution. It's not like that anymore. There's a certain group of Republicans that are much more either far, far right, or they just have this mindset of, I don't trust the government at all. I don't trust, they're conspiracy theorists. So it's not really 100% down the line, but you really got to look at, like, are they, reasonable, conservative-minded without being too crazy? They tend to be your good jurors. They have education in the hard sciences, business also. They tend to be very business-focused, pro-company. They work in analyzing professions. They think in terms of black and white, as opposed to people who are in the arts who are much more gray. I mentioned before, they have that high internal locus of control, so they believe in personal responsibility. There's people who are paying their bills on time, who are balancing their checkbooks. They're not going to have bankruptcies in their history because they got all their stuff together. And they feel like, I have all my stuff together and I'm successful because I earned it. I did good. As opposed to someone saying, well, I'm successful because I had opportunities or because of white privilege. So those people are just like, they believe that everything they own is because oh gosh, my Baltimore just came out. They own is because of, they earned it. All right, they also tend to be cynical of other people. So sometimes you say like, oh, I don't like that juror. That juror actually might be a great juror. You don't have to go have a beer with them. You just have to say like, are they going to be a good juror for my case? And people who are cynical of other people can actually be really great jurors for the prosecution. And they believe that people need to look out for themselves. It's the buyer beware mindset over seller be fair. Again, it goes back to that internal locus of control. All right, so let's go over some key principles of voir dire. First one seems obvious, but be a good representative. Sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised. Now, in California, the lawyers get to ask questions. And this one time, this lawyer said, what's your pet peeves? And this lady raised her hand and she's like, guys like you. You got on the elevator before women. You got off the elevator before women. You walked in here empty-handed while all those women are carrying boxes. Guys like you make me mad. So the point being there is that you should feel like the camera is always rolling and the microphone is always on. One other thing I do is post-trial interviews where we call the jurors up afterwards and talk to them about the case. And we can do that here in Maryland. And one time I asked, what'd you think about the attorney? And they said, well, he never washed his hands when he got out of the bathroom. So like jurors are watching you all the time and you just never know. So when you're down the street at Royal Farms, you never know. The juror could be behind you. You pulling in the parking lot or the garage, you never know. So you just always be on your absolute best behavior. Then also remember that you need to be a good representative in the courtroom too during voir dire. If you have an opportunity to do follow-up questions with the jurors, it's not an examination. You should not be treating them like a witness. You should be treating them like a person and just say, wow, you said, I heard you said to the judge that your father was in the police force. Okay, great. And so tell me about, you want to talk to them like they're a person instead of writing down their notes and like questioning them like you would a witness. So be a good representative for your client. This second piece is very counterintuitive. And it's the concept of you want jurors to say the worst things about the government from the start in voir dire. You don't want them to come out and say good things because then the other side's going to get rid of them. So when you have to give a statement of the case, of what the statement of the case is about, you actually want to tank it. You want to throw your statement of the case so that it's the worst statement of the case for your side. You don't want to put your good facts in there. So if you have a statement of the case, you don't want to say in there, the defendant was, there's 5 eyewitnesses that spotted the defendant and their fingerprints were on the weapon. You wouldn't want to put that in a statement of the case because then all your good jurors are going to say, I think it sounds like he's, I think he sounds guilty. You've just outed your good jurors for the other side to get rid of. So you really want to tilt it the other way if you can. So it'll depend on the judge how much you can put in that statement of the case, but you really want to reserve your strong points. You have the entire rest of the trial to win the jurors over. You do not want to win them over in voir dire. You want to hide your good jurors and expose the bad ones. So reserve your strong points to the extent you can. Preview your weaknesses. The defendant was spotted, and the eyewitness pointed out 2 potential defendants or something like that. Anything that's a bad fact in your case, if you can put that in the statement of the case, or if the other side puts it in there, don't object to it. Let them put the bad stuff in there because that's going to draw those bad jurors out who are going to say, I think this guy was wrongfully charged or there's not probable cause here if that was the case. So I realize that in Maryland you're limited on what you can do in voir dire, but to the extent you can do a statement of the case, you usually get a little short one. You either want it to be tanked or thrown, what I say, or make it as vanilla as possible and don't put any facts in there at all and just say the prosecution is going to prove that the defendant this, and this, and that's it. So we call that the vanilla statement of the case. The third thing is how you ask your questions. So I know that you get an opportunity to propose questions to the judge. You need to put thought into those questions in terms of what is the distribution of the response going to be in Baltimore City. Every question is not necessarily going to be a good question for you depending on the distribution. So let me give you an example. This question, do you believe police treat black suspects unfairly? And you've got a black defendant. That's actually a terrible question to ask in Baltimore because what's going to happen is almost everyone's going to agree with that question. And you're going to get a bunch of people that raise their hand. And so all you did was identify for the defense attorney the 5 people that didn't raise their hand to that, who are going to be your best jurors. And so you want to ask the question so that you're only identifying a handful of people. Every voir dire question you ask should be less than 50% of the panel raising their hands. If more than 50% is raising their hands, it's a bad question. So you want to make the question such that you're only getting a handful of responses. If you're only getting 2 or 3 responses, you're doing it right. You're identifying the worst of the worst. So we say hide your keeps by asking a stronger question like, do you believe most police officers routinely treat black suspects unfairly? When you word it in a stronger way like that, you're going to have less people that are raising their hand, and you're only now identifying the worst of the worst jurors. Then it goes without saying, rehabbing your best jurors. Now, usually the judge will do that for you and try to get your good jurors to stay. But to the extent you have an opportunity to ask questions or follow-ups, you might do something like this. Let's say that one of your jurors has a parent who is a police officer. You might say something like, okay, so your father was a police officer. Do you believe that all police officers are the same? They're going to say no, right? Do you believe that some officers make mistakes or exercise poor judgment from time to time? They're going to say yes to that. So do you know any of the officers involved in this case? No, they don't. So can you just judge the witnesses who testify in the case by what they say here in the courtroom rather than on some general opinion you have of police in general? So let me say, yeah, and can you set aside whatever general feelings you may have about police officers and just judge the case on its merits? So that should be enough to rehab the person, but if you need to go further, and if the prosecution doesn't prove their case against the defendant, could you side in favor of the defendant? The court will give you certain instructions as to what laws apply. Will you just be able to follow those laws? And despite any general opinions you have. And so you can give a shot to both sides. So any of those questions are great questions. I know you're not going to be able to ask them all in Maryland. You can only get like 1 or 2. But any of these questions will really help you get to rehab the person, especially if you can just remind them, like, all police officers aren't the same. Some do make mistakes, and then you can go in for one of those. So you can just set it aside and judge this case on the merits, can't you? And that's how you can rehab a juror. And I say, there's some language in here that's intentional. When I say, rather than just some general opinion you have, I say it that way, it's because you're supposed to be reminding the person that it's just so general. Like, of course you're not going to rely on just some general belief. So you want to say it like that. You know, are you going to follow the evidence and not just based on some general belief you have, right? It's all in the way that you say it is how you can get people to say what you want them to say. So I don't know if you're going to be able to do this one in Maryland, but I love this one so much that I want to share it with you. If the juror says they'll try to be fair or they'll try to set something aside, if you have an opportunity and the judge will let you, you can say something like, well, you can understand if you were a pilot and I was going to get on a plane and I asked if you could land the plane and you said you'd try, you can understand why we wouldn't feel too comfortable getting on that plane. So we just need to know, can you do it? Can you do that? Can you be a fair juror for us? When you word it like that, the juror's more inclined to say, yeah, I can do it. And that'll get them over that hump of I'll try. Because some judges, if the juror says I'll try, they will strike them for cause because they say, that's equivocal and I don't think that juror should be seated. But if you can get them to say, yeah, I can do it, you can rehab jurors that way. The whole goal of voir dire is to eliminate the bad jurors, not to indoctrinate jurors. You can't really indoctrinate jurors in voir dire anyway, so you don't want to be asking questions like, you know, and I don't even know in a criminal context how I would do this, but questions that are aimed to precondition people, you don't want to ask those kind of questions like, does everyone here agree that people should be responsible for their own safety? Does everyone here agree? You don't want to ask questions like that are designed to precondition because you're trying to identify bad jurors to get them kicked off, not precondition. Again, you have the entire rest of your case to argue your case. You want to eliminate jurors first. And so I mentioned the value of preconditioning because there's some lawyers that feel very, very like, oh no, I want to get in jurors' minds right away, all these topics. Well, it doesn't really work. The whole idea of preconditioning is based on the power of suggestion. In psychology terms, we call it priming. It's the idea that if you ask a question, you can influence the response. It doesn't really work on juries because the response that you're trying to influence, their verdict, is several days or even weeks down the line. What you say to them in voir dire, they're not going to remember by the time they get into the deliberation room. So you can't convince anybody of your case in voir dire. And also, jurors aren't really invested at this stage. Most of them don't think they're going to be on the jury. You ever see the look of surprise when they call the juror names? They're like, what, me? I didn't even raise my hand to anything. So they're not really paying attention about how your questions relate to the case, and they don't know how your questions relate to the case. So if you're talking in a speeding case and you're saying, speeding is speeding, and whether you're 1 mile over the speed limit or not, it's speeding, right? Does everyone agree with that? You don't want to do that in your case. Instead, you want to ask who here thinks that it's not really a big deal to go 1 or 2 miles an hour over the speed limit. I know none of you would get tickets for 1 or 2 miles an hour, but you get the idea. And the effects with priming fade with time. It's also just really hard to change somebody's mind, even with evidence. You're not going to change their mind with how you ask a question. Your time during voir dire, your precious few questions that you get are better spent getting rid of your bad jurors. You also want to anticipate the group dynamics and identify who is going to be the leaders of the jury. I like to break down different jurors into, I think, I have 5 categories. We have leaders who are going to run the show. They may not be, well, in Maryland, I don't know if it's the same in criminal, but in civil, it's always juror number 1. But it's who's going to lead the jury. It's going to be your leaders. You're going to have your followers who are really just going to go along with everybody else. You're going to have your active deliberators, people that will participate, but at the end of the day, they're going to be persuaded by other people. Or you have passive participants who really just only once or twice, they may chime in with something or just say, yeah, I agree with that. I agree with what he said. They passively participate. Or you're going to have those contrarians that I mentioned earlier. So every time I'm doing a juror, I'm grading them, A through F, how they are, and I grade them on that scale of what kind of juror they are. So how do you figure that out? Watch the jurors on breaks. Who's opening up the little door for other jurors? If they have to fill something out, who's handing out pens? Somebody coughs, who's giving out candy? Who's the person that's asking a lot of questions? What time is lunch? How long is trial going to last? All of those people are going to be likely leaders of that panel, so you want to note that down, because if you have a leader who you think is maybe like what I would call a C- or a D juror, who is a leader, that's more threatening to me than a D- or an F juror that's a follower. So you have to keep in mind the group dynamics there. And the last principle here is to do your research. I think I have clients who are often surprised that there's actually case law that has to deal with jury selection. There is case law on, well, if a juror says they'll try, is that a cause challenge or not? There is case law on if a juror has a vacation, is that a substantial hardship? You know, not in every state's going to have every situation, but there is case law out there, so you should come prepared for jury selection with this is the standard for cause, and that juror did or did not meet it based on the legal standard. Because you may have a judge that says, they said they'll try, they're equivocating, I'm going to get rid of them. Well, Your Honor, based on People v. Johnson, if a juror says they'll try, then the judge has an obligation to ask them if they can actually do it. There's case law like that in every state, and so make sure you do that research before you show for jury selection. And then I also said do your research could also be social media research. Now my understanding, and you could correct me wrong because I'm not licensed in Maryland, but my understanding is that this is the rule that applies for jury selection and whether you can do social media searches. When it comes to the jury list, you'll get the jury list. It will have the list of names in it. It will also have the zip code, age, gender, education, occupation. You can distribute that list to people who are employed by you who are assisting in jury selection. So that could be people back at your office. It could be a research firm like my firm that does the research. Anyone that you hire, you can give the jury list to. But they can't disseminate it beyond that. And that's my understanding of what the law is in Maryland. And you could correct me if I'm missing something, but that's how we've always operated in our civil cases. I have my first criminal case in Maryland next week, but I've mostly done just civil cases here in Baltimore. But really, you can do these searches unless the judge has a specific rule. So you want to check the local rules of that judge, and if the judge says you can't do searches, then you can't do searches. But there is no rule that I'm aware of in Maryland that says that you can't. You just can't contact the jurors. So you have to be mindful if you're looking at people's LinkedIn, your LinkedIn must be on private mode. Because if it's not on private mode, they're going to get an alert that said so-and-so at the state's attorney's office has seen your profile. Under some bar, they consider that juror contact. So if you're going to look at somebody's LinkedIn, make sure you are on private mode or you're doing it from your spouse's account or something because you don't want that juror to have that juror contact. And you can't friend request. I mean, that seems to be all obvious. I think you all know that. But you'd be surprised about what you can find out about people online. So remember I said earlier that one of the most predictive things is locus of control? How are you supposed to ask about that in jury selection? You can't. It's not like you can really, I mean, you could in California maybe say like, what do you think is the major cause of crime? And someone with an internal locus of control will say something like people are lazy and they'd rather steal, or people don't have strong willpower. And you'd have other people, externals will say, well, there's societal differences, there's lack of opportunity. But in Maryland, you're probably not gonna be able to ask those questions. But if you can get some people to do some online research for you and send your list of names of the jurors back to the office and have people doing some social media, you could find stuff like this. So this juror, let me tell you about this juror first. This juror had a GED education and he was a union worker. And this was in Pittsburgh. And so you might think, this juror might not be great for me if he's pro worker and maybe not that educated. But let's see what he posts online is things like, if you put on a pair of gloves to put air in your tire, you should no longer be identified as a man. He posts about the common sense test. He posts about how his son was complaining about the lack of internet, and he says, you gotta love the new generation of technology-spoiled kids. He says, if you're working today, don't whine about how cold it is, be grateful you have a job and you can keep your family warm. He says that your work ethic determines your job security, and that successful people take responsibility and unsuccessful people blame others. Do you want this juror? Heck yeah. Like, this is a great juror for a prosecutor because they're very big on personal responsibility and internal locus of control. And you never would have known that had you not seen these posts. On the flip side, you could have these other jurors. So this Maria is an administrative assistant. That's all we really knew about her. She didn't say anything, didn't raise her hand to any questions. And Pennsylvania is very similar where we don't get to do attorney voir dire. And then Sarah was a master's in library science whose husband was an engineer for Lockheed Martin. And so we thought, okay, she's pretty educated, probably fairly wealthy. She might be a decent juror for the prosecution. Well, Maria posts things like this, like, before you start to judge me, step into my shoes, then you'll know how strong I really am. Here's a tip for you. If someone is posting about how strong they really are, it's because they're not that strong. It's like people that post a lot of selfies. It's just sort of a red flag. Sarah here talks about how she got her feelings hurt hard this week, per usual. And she goes on to say that I'm a blade of weaponized vulnerability. In this instant, I was reminded we're better together than apart. May we always find ourselves in such beautiful company. It's lovely, but Maria is, again, posting memes about her breakup and how the loyal one stays single. The other one has already moved on. Maria saying she's so sick of being stressed and tired and pushed and pulled. Enough is enough. Sarah saying, who needs a compliment? Let's start a compliment thread. And she pretty much just lit up the teacher who called her kid challenging. Words matter, y'all. Do you want these jurors? No. These are high external locus of control jurors that are looking to blame other people or looking to help out people. So we wouldn't have known that, any of this stuff. We had very little information. So if you had an opportunity to do some Googling, don't do it in the courtroom. You got to have somebody doing it outside the courtroom, or if you're going to do it in the courtroom, it has to be someone whose back is against the wall with the screen protector, and just make sure that there's no local rules that prohibit it. But you can learn a lot about people. All right. So let me move on to the next section now. I know that in Maryland, it is very difficult. It's very difficult to get a cause challenge in Maryland, but every cause challenge you get is just one more better that you have that the other side didn't have. It gets you one step closer to the defendants. Because, right, defendants get more strikes than, is that same here in Maryland? Okay. Yeah, so you're already limited in what you can strike, but every challenge you can get, the better off you are. And this was really huge in the Chauvin trial, because we had a lot of people who were, in our favor that we had to fight hard to rehab. But there was also a lot of people in Minnesota who we did not want on that jury, and we know, and they had, I think, 15 strikes, and we had 9, and then they ended up upping and giving the defense more strikes. So every cause challenge was really important in that case. So how do you get jurors to reveal their biases? One thing is to try to help them, to put them at ease. So when I mentioned earlier about being a good representative, you should not have perfect posture. I know, like you would argue to a judge. It really should be much more relaxed. If you're able to kind of lean a little bit and you're just kind of talking with them, that's going to help them feel more relaxed opening up with you. And so you're going to want to put jurors like ease. You have to remember that jurors really hate public speaking. I don't know if you've ever been at the bench before and there's like a juror that's shaking just talking to the judge. There's people that are just terrified of public speaking and speaking to a judge especially. So do what you can to try to put the juror at ease. One of those things is just to make it normalized. You can say to jurors, hey, I understand you said you have some strong opinions about police officers. Doesn't mean you're not a fair person. Everybody here has opinions on things. Do you think that might affect the way you view the evidence? So you're adding that piece, like, doesn't mean you're not a fair person. Will it affect the way you see the evidence in this case? And if you're able to say, if you think about a trial as being a baseball game, do you think you'd really be the right person to be an umpire in a case like this? Would you tend to call the balls and strikes in favor of the defendant because of your experiences? And you sort of normalize the response, like, look, I'm just being an umpire. It doesn't mean I'm not fair. It just means I might have a little bit of a bias. And then you can even make it non-judgmental by saying things like, look, I know you said that you don't like prosecutors, or you raised your hand that you don't like prosecutors, and you're not going to offend me. Look, I'm a lawyer. I've heard every joke in the book. Do you have some feelings about prosecutors that might affect whether you believe that we're credible or not? One word is, if you can, to keep the victim out of the courtroom, family members out of the courtroom during the voir dire, because people don't want to say bad things about people when they're kind of sitting right there, or say I can't be fair to the family. Or you might even out your good jurors, because if you have a very sympathetic victim, you might have a juror who says, I've had this happen, where the person looks at them and they say, I see her sitting there and I see myself in her. Or I could see the pain on her face. I know that she's been harmed. You don't want to out your good jurors like that. So have the victim stay out, the victim's family stay out, and if you need to introduce them because the judge is requiring you to introduce them, you could say, these are the family members, but they're going to step out of the room during this phase to give you all some privacy, and have them leave so that they're not front of mind for the jurors when they're raising their hands and talking to the judge. And so then if you're doing individual follow-up with jurors, you can, again, think it'd be a struggle to be a fair umpire, tempted to call balls and strikes. Those are just the same examples I gave a moment ago. Also remember that words matter, and the way that you word a question can influence the response. And so this is really psychological research that funds this. People are more likely to raise their hand if you say, how many people believe, as opposed to, does anyone believe? How many of you believe implies that this is a normal belief. Lots of people are going to feel this way. How many people believe this? As opposed to, does anyone? Now, the judge is going to ask the question how they want to ask the question, but it doesn't hurt to put it in that way. How many people believe this way? And maybe you'll get more people who are willing to stand up and raise their hand and admit. You can also say, if you can get this in a question, some people believe that police officers, blah, blah, blah. Who here believes that, agrees with that? You can word the question like that. That, again, makes it seem like it's a normal belief, and it's okay to feel that way. You should also assume the response. So if you're doing follow-up questions in an individual follow-up, instead of saying, would it be difficult to set that aside, ask them, how difficult would that be to set aside? Because when you say how difficult, it kind of implies that it's going to be difficult. And they're going to feel more comfortable saying, yeah, it's actually going to be pretty difficult. So you want to word it so that it's kind of more open-ended questions. And you want to get the jurors to rephrase it into their own words. So say someone here was falsely arrested or something, or they had a brother who went to prison, and you would say, how were you affected by that? This is one of the single most powerful questions you can ask in a voir dire, is how were you affected by that? Because people will break down. And you have someone whose brother went to prison or something, and they will just, it tore our family apart. You know, like they'll just go into it and they'll start to cry, and you'll have them gone for cause. So not that we want to make people cry, but it's a good way to get a cause challenge. So how were you affected by that? Same thing like in civil cases when people have cancer experiences. How were you affected by that? Oh my gosh, people lose it. So phrases to avoid: cannot, unable to, and have a problem with. Nobody wants to admit that they can't do something or has a problem. So you don't want to say, would you have a problem siding with the would you have a problem siding with the government here? Because they're going to be like, no, I don't have a problem. You're the one with the problem. You want to say things like, do you think it might be difficult? Would you struggle with? So use difficulty with, struggle with first. It's the get your foot in the door kind of technique. If you can ask two questions, you could do one question that's foot in the door. Would you have difficulty, or would you struggle with sending, putting a person, knowing that they're going to go to prison for a case? Would you struggle with that, sending someone to prison? And if the juror says, yeah, I would struggle with that, okay, so you think that that might affect your decision in this case, and get them to say that. And then you have the answer should be yes. So if you are asking a yes or no question, word the question such that the answer that you want is yes. So you don't want to say, if you're trying to get rid of a juror, you don't want to say, so can you set that aside? Because they're going to say yes, and you don't want them to say that. You're going to say, would you have difficulty setting that aside? Then they say yes, and now you've got the cause challenge. So remember, most people want to say yes in response to an authority figure, and you all are authority figures to jurors. So they're going to want to say yes, no matter what you ask. Now, it's not going to work every time. There's going to be some jurors that are like, nope, can't do it. But you at least are increasing the likelihood and the odds that you will. Your body language also matters. So when you're talking with a juror, and if you're doing individual follow-up, or even if they're just talking with a judge, just doing a very, very subtle head nod as you're talking to them is they're going to start to nod their head, and it's like, so what I'm hearing you say is that you might have some difficulty here siding with the government, and so I can understand that, given your experiences with your brother. So you see, I'm just doing like this very subtle head nod. It gets the juror to start to nod their head, and then they're like, yeah, and they go along with it. You can use that on your family members too, it works. Do like with kids, like, you really want to go to bed early, right? So just nod along, and then if you're in a jurisdiction where you're asking people to raise their hand versus speaking up, just people are more likely to raise their hands than they are to speak up, so it's better to say, just show of hands here. Show of hands here, who here has a family member that has had a drug issue, as opposed to saying, who here has had a family member with a drug issue? Everyone's going to kind of like freeze up. It's more like just a show of hands. I don't want to ask any follow-up, just a show of hands. That'll make people raise their hands more. And it just normalizes the responses for them. And you want to empathize with the juror, even if that opinion doesn't really help your case. So say like the juror had a family member who went to prison, and you really want to empathize with them and say, gosh, that sounds like an awful experience. I can't imagine what that did to your family. And show empathy by mirroring the juror's facial expressions. This is psychology 101 of therapy. The therapist is taught to mimic facial expressions. So if the juror is like wincing their brow, you should wince their brow. If the juror's pissed off, you should be like, yeah, I can understand why you'd be really upset by that. So it's matching the juror's tone is going to get them to empathize and open up to you. And ultimately, if they're open to you, they're more likely to admit that they can't be fair. All right, so that's sort of getting them to reveal the bias. Now you got to get the step of getting them to admit that they can't be fair, and that's the tough part. The first step is to disarm the juror. So I talked about making them feel comfortable and relaxed. Start with easy questions. If you're drafting your voir dire for the judge, start with the easy ones. Who here has experience in law? Then work your way to the more difficult ones about like drug use and things like that. Because if you come right out of the gate asking about drug use, people are going to clam up. Start with those easier questions first. If you have an opportunity to do individual follow-up, remind the juror what they said. So if they said something to the judge and they said, I think that prosecutors, or let's use police officers, that's the easy one. I think police officers are the root of all evil. So you want to repeat that back to them, what they said. So you said to the judge, that police officers are the root of all evil. Tell me more about that. Can you tell us more about that? And so you want to remind the juror what they said. And the reason why is because some judges don't take great notes. If you notice that. So you want to just remind the judge what the juror said and use the juror's exact language. It also helps to strengthen the record. So if you do have a court reporter, you've now got it twice in the record that the juror said this. And you're forcing the juror to commit. The whole idea is you want the juror to kind of dig themselves into their position where they can't dig themselves out because it's like, I did say that police officers are the root of all evil. I guess I probably can't be fair in this case. So you're forcing the juror to commit by reminding them what they said. If you're able to, I know some judges will limit the number of people at the bench, but if you're able to have a second person, you should not be the one, and you're doing the questioning, not be the one taking the notes. It's going to make a juror feel uncomfortable if you're sitting there writing down everything they say as you're looking at them. Have somebody else kind of next to you writing the notes or taking the notes if you can, and you should be connecting with that juror. Ask the juror to elaborate if possible. So these are all great questions for your follow-up. If you're allowed to ask anything, tell us more about that. What led you to develop that opinion? How long have you held that belief? And again, my favorite one is, how were you affected by that experience? So in a successful voir dire, you really should have the jurors doing more of the talking. And so that's why you want to ask those open-ended questions. If you can, ask another question. Get them to acknowledge it would be difficult to change. And this is all around the principle of cognitive dissonance, that all that means is people don't want to be hypocrites. Nobody likes to be hypocrites. So people want to be consistent in their beliefs and their actions. So you could say something like, how likely is it you're going to stick to your guns on this? How difficult would it be for us to change your mind? And so jurors will take greater ownership if they use their own words. So that's why I'm saying how difficult, how likely. That way they're using their own words and they're, again, digging themselves deeper into that hole of bias. And then step 5, which is what I mentioned earlier, it's your get the foot in the door question. It's called a softball question. Do you think that might color your view of the case? You want to ease them in with softer language, but bring it home to this case. So these are just some examples. Could that experience color how you view the evidence in this case? How difficult would it be to set that aside and just render a decision solely on the evidence? And again, you can remind them what they said. Given that you said that police officers are the root of all evil, do you think that might color your view of the evidence in this case when a police officer testifies? Do you think so those are questions like easy get in the foot door questions. And then the last question is what I call go in for the kill. That's your cause question. So it's the magic words, whatever they are in Maryland. If it's fair and impartial, it varies by state. But you should know the statutory language and the case law in your state. And to make sure that the answer that you ask, the question is yes. Remember that from earlier. So these are just some examples. If the standard is completely fair and impartial, then you would just say, would that terrible experience make it too difficult to be completely fair and impartial in this case? Or in, I think it's Missouri, the standard is it would influence their judgment. So you'd say, will that experience influence your judgment? In Georgia, the standard is they have doubts about their ability to be fair. So you might say it just like that. And just don't assume that the standard is the same in every jurisdiction because it's not. So if you transfer out of Maryland, don't assume it's the same. You got to check the new case law. So here's my other thing. What do they say if they'll try? You guys are probably going to be able to do this in Baltimore, but something that we do in other states, if the juror says they'll try and you want them off. So remember, if they say they'll try and you want them on, you use the pilot example. If they say they'll try and you want them off, you could say something like, are you familiar with the character Yoda? You ever see those movies? Well, there's a scene where Luke tells Yoda, he's about to go on a mission, and Yoda says, can you do it? And he said, I'll try. And Yoda said, do or do not. Do or do not, there is no try. And basically what Yoda's saying is, if you aren't 100% sure that you can do this, pass the mission off to somebody who can. Because there's many other jurors here who don't have any doubts at all. So, do you think you can be 100% sure that you can do this? Or do you have some doubts and this is something that you should pass off? And the juror is more likely to say, yeah, I have some doubts. I don't think I should pass this off to another juror. So that's the Yoda example. So just a very quick recap. And I'm happy to share my slides with y'all too. Very quick recap. Disarm the juror if you can. Remind the juror what they said. Ask them to elaborate. Get them to acknowledge it would be difficult to change. Throw a softball question and go in for the kill. So this may take a total of 3 to 4 questions. So if you're only allowed 3 to 4 follow-ups, I would remind the juror what they said and ask them to elaborate as my first one. I would ask them, I would throw them a softball question first, might that color your judgment? And then I would go into, okay, so given that, do you think that you wouldn't be able to be completely fair and impartial in this case? If you've only got 3 questions, those are kind of your 1, 2, 3s to get through that. All right, so I will stop there. I do have a little bit more to go if people are able to stick around. I don't know where we are on the time, but I would just want to stop to see if there's any questions about voir dire generally. And then I think Scott mentioned I do have a book. I'm not gonna make you all buy the book. If you email me, I will send you a PDF copy of the book, and it has, I think, 4 or 5 chapters on criminal cases, and it'll say in there, these questions are for defendants, these questions are for prosecutors. I'm happy to share that with y'all. So any questions at this point? Anybody? Don't be shy, yes.
We often see jurors who don't answer a single question. They don't tell what to do in that.
Yeah, I've had 2 approaches to that. And one, it just happens in Maryland. We've asked some judges to put on the questionnaire, if you did not raise your hand to any questions, please raise your hand. And then that person raised their hand, and that way we come up, and then they have to come up to the bench. We just say, any thoughts going through your mind as you sat here through any of this? And that's the only question we can ask them. At least we can see them that way. Some judges will be like, no, I'm not asking that. But you can ask. It doesn't hurt to ask, right? And then the other thing is just the social media searches. If you only have time to search like 5 people, search the 5 people who didn't raise their hand. You don't need to search people that you already know everything about. No point wasting your time with that. It's the people that don't raise their hand that if you can do searches of. But sometimes you're stuck. Just always be observant. See if they're when they do roll call. If they're one of those people that say, actually this is important. If they say present, and they stand up and say present, that's probably going to be a good juror for you, as opposed to someone's like here. Because they're someone who's taking the law much more seriously. Anything else? Yeah? Go ahead.
The one question that almost everyone raises their hand to in Baltimore is if you've been the victim of a crime, that gets them up to the bench. Are there some suggestions you have for how to get them to elaborate, since those are jurors and will be asked more questions?
Yeah, so some of those jurors you probably don't even want them to elaborate, because they're going to be your good jurors if they've been a victim of the crime. So some of those people you almost don't want them to ask that question. But a better question might be something like, who here has had a family member who was arrested? That would help out your better jurors. But asking them questions, really just like, tell me about that, is the best way to get people to open up. Just tell me about that. And they'll, instead of asking yes or no questions, the open-ended stuff will get them better. Yeah, go there and then.
I have a question about group dynamics of potential jurors. Do you have an opinion about whether to inquire as to the jurors' willingness to report juror misconduct? And I'm asking this, there was some voir dire techniques around the Aurora movie theater shooting and asking jurors, that was a death thing. But just like as a general thing, you think that's something to ask about? Like if the juror is bullying you to your opinion, or is it otherwise preventing you from deliberating? How would you handle that? Is that something?
I've never asked that question, but it's not. I don't think that's not a bad question, especially if you think that's an issue that you've seen before. To ask that, it's hard to put that in a judge-led voir dire, but it could just be like, is there anyone who would have difficulty deliberating, or feels like they would feel pressured from other jurors? But
Yeah, I think here it would be more towards jurors pressuring each other to nullify.
Okay, yeah. So if you can ask a question about that, I think that would certainly be helpful. It's just how to word it would depend on the judge.
Do you think you could like somehow sort of ask a question that's a pretext about jury nullification?
Yeah, so that would be one of the examples of the some people believe. Some people believe that jurors have a right to not follow the law. Does anybody agree with that? Raise your hand if you, or stand up if you agree with that question, that principle. That might just be this way. Some people believe, who here agrees with that principle, and that would help identify those people. Yeah, that's a great one. I'm going to add that to my book. Yeah, over here.
Do you have any tips on body language? Like if when the juror comes up that stands next to you and they're angled away from you a little bit, or if they have one foot in front of the other, or they're just kind of like blading themselves away from you, is there something like anything about posture or behavior at the bench that you can rely on?
Not that's that reliable. I think that's probably body language of the juror is one of the least reliable things. And I see clients will say like, oh, that juror doesn't like me because their arms are crossed. Well, maybe they're just cold, or like they have a big belly and it's comfortable to sit like that. So you really don't want to read too much into people's body language, except is it different between you and the other side? That's what you're looking for. Not their body language in general, but if they're facing the other side, yeah, and talking to the other side a lot and just totally cold shouldering you, that may be something. But if they're just watching the judge straight ahead, there's no bias there for either side. Same thing during your opening. If the jurors are sitting back in their chair like this during one side, but then the other side they're leaning forward and taking a lot of notes, that means something because it's different. But just don't say, oh, her arms were crossed, or she looks like a bee. She may just have that resting face. So you can't judge people by how they look most of the time. Yeah.
I usually strike people when they get in the, because I like to strike from the box. When they get in the box, when they start sitting there looking angry, like they're mad to be there. If I have spare strikes, I'm getting rid of that person. I mean, would you agree with that, or what are your thoughts on that? Like they just.
Yeah, for the most part, you, as a prosecutor, you don't want people who don't want to be there because jurors feel like you're kind of the reason why they're there. So if someone is really, really upset, they're more likely to take it out on you than they are on the defendant. In a civil case, it's a little different. They're actually more likely to take it out on the plaintiff, but it's the person who brought the case is who they're more likely. So yeah, if they're really pissed, you don't want somebody like that. But in that situation, it's almost, we try to stipulate, or like with the other side, or get the judge to stipulate, like, this juror is just gonna be disruptive, this juror is not gonna follow the law. If you could try to get them off that way and not have to burn a strike on them.
By the time we get to that point, we're not on the bench anymore.
Yeah.
So I don't think we have I don't see an opportunity to be able to do that.
Yes. So if you got the ones to burn, then yeah, absolutely, we'll do that. That's good.
What's your opinion on people that are engineers or like certain types of sciences where it's very exacting? I've heard before that if they're trying to be, it's easier in that case for the defense attorney to make beyond reasonable doubt use something very technical and high standard, and they would be exacting on that. Is that something that you describe?
Really, that's more fact dependent. I think generally speaking, we do want engineers because engineers are rule followers. For the most part, they're rule followers and they believe in like rules and laws. But if you've got a case where maybe it's a little loose on whether it was the defendant or what the state of mind was, and it's something like that, then you may not want to engineer in that case because they're going to want it to be more certain. So I think it just is going to depend on how strong your case are and what the facts of the case are to really know that. Yep.
How do you feel about jurors that have a special expertise in something that's going to come up in your trial? Like you have ballistics evidence and you've got someone that is very knowledgeable on guns.
Yeah, usually you don't want that. Usually you don't want that person because they will criticize what was done and be like, that's not how we do it, or they tend to. And I wouldn't necessarily even want like a police officer for some things because people tend to like, I do a lot more civil cases, so people think, oh, well, a truck driver is going to be good. No, they want to distance themselves because I would never do that. I would have done this. And so it's just too risky. I mean, they could be a great juror for you, but it's just too much of a risk to that person would run the jury and make up their own stuff and be an expert in the room. So we try to get them, again, another stipulation if possible, like this juror has special expertise, and I don't think either side wants this person here, and get them off that way so you don't have to burn a strike. I think it was one over here.
My colleague who asked the question about whether jurors will answer the question most commonly in Baltimore City, have you or anybody in your immediate family been the victim or witness to a crime? And I think that is the most commonly answered question in this jurisdiction. But it is also extremely common for people to answer 0 of the 18 questions that get in addition to that question, do you have any sage wisdom about dealing with jurors who we've gotten this list of names as the jurors are being created into the courtroom? I've had this list for about an hour, and the only thing I know about them is their demographic information. Any tips or tricks about how to deal with situations like that beyond demographics? Yeah,
I mean, if that's all you have, it's really good. You have to do some social media searches of the people that are at the front of the list that you're most
shocked
like. Yeah,
there's a 0 chance that I'm going to get somebody to do social media search.
Yeah, I would say the least predictive thing is going to be demographics. But if all I have is demographics, I'm probably going to want older jurors. If I'm a prosecutor, older jurors are more likely to be more conservative. I'm probably going to want white jurors, if we're being honest, just because that's. Well, now I'm just going on.
They're also the Granola jurors.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. So that's what I'm saying. It's never 100%. We're just talking about statistically, because you're going to have people that are up in Hamden that are going to be terrible jurors for you, but you're going to have. Sorry, just people live there. So I feel. I think one just a little sticker. Jury selection. It sounds awful that we are stereotyping people, but that is it's about statistics. If 6 out of 10 people, 6 out of 10 white people are going to vote our way, then you want white. It's statistics, and so doesn't mean it's going to be everyone. That's why I said it sucks that you have to go after demographics, but if that's all you got. But hopefully you'll have other questions once they get seated, and you can start to learn more about people. But also just watching how they dress. People that tend to dress better are going to be better for you because they're taking the law more seriously. People that tend to be more respectful tend to be better jurors. I'm going to rely on that a lot more than I'm going to rely on the demographics. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I love the recap questions. I'm definitely going to steal your slides. How would you respond to a Batson challenge when you are trying to make judgments off of the basis of limited information?
That's a challenge too. Absolutely. Always have, for every strike you have, like what is your reason? You better have a reason. That reason can be, I observed the person coming in, they didn't seem to be taking the process seriously. They said, yeah, I'm here, instead of saying present. They didn't stand up when they were asked to stand up. And you should have a reason written down for every single strike that you have, a non-race-based reason. And you will. I mean, you'll have a reason why you're striking that person. It might just be because we don't know anything about them, and they didn't raise their hand, so I'm striking them based on that. And the judge may say, well, there's other people that didn't raise their hand. Well, I only got so many strikes, so I'm going off of that minus plus age or education, and that's just always have that reason ready to go. All right, yes.
Do you agree with the common wisdom that you shouldn't allow an attorney on the jury?
Depends on the type of attorney.
Because I've had good results on both sides.
Yeah, me too.
When attorneys have gotten on jury.
Yeah, I actually had a judge on a jury once. I think it just depends. If it's someone that's doing like real estate law and like wills and trust, I don't know if I would want, like, obviously don't probably want a criminal defense attorney, but other attorneys, civil, if you're going civil, I'd probably go on civil defendants, because the profiles are kind of flipped for civil cases. So what's good for you in a criminal case is flipped in a civil case. So you probably want people that represent corporations. They tend to be more conservative and internal locus of control. Yeah, all good questions. All right, let me wrap up. If we have time, I just wanted to do one little piece on developing themes, because I think this is so important. And there's not much you can do in jury selection in Maryland, so I wanted to give you something that you can really implement a lot of, and that's coming up with themes. So these are 3 themes that we use in cases: culture of callousness, pride over policing, and review, approved, and discussed. So those are 3 themes. Just kind of remember those themes if you can. So what is a theme? A theme is a headline of your case. You should have roughly 3 to 4, maybe 5 at most, themes for your case. And it's going to be a headline. An argument is not a theme. A complete sentence is not a theme. It should just be a headline. It should be something that is short, pithy, and simple. And it's something that ultimately you want jurors to write down and repeat. A juror is not going to speak like a lawyer. They're not going to talk about, they may say beyond a reasonable doubt just because they've heard it on TV, but they're not going to talk about things in the way that you're going to talk about them. So you have to put your arguments into juror language, juror-friendly language, because ultimately you want them to write it down and then repeat it in deliberations. That's the whole point of a theme, is to get them to write it down and repeat it. And so it should be something that is memorable and repeatable, obviously. And the whole concept is to arm your good jurors with something they can argue. Again, the good jurors are not going to be able to argue your case if all your talking is in legalese, because they're not going to repeat that. And they're going to struggle in the deliberation room to come up with arguments because they can't get it out, what they want to say. And so you got to give them terms in their terms, how they're going to talk, to get them to be able to argue your case for you. And so why are themes needed? It actually comes down to the psychological principle of memory processing. There's 3 stages to memory. You have to encode the information, you have to be able to store it throughout the trial, and then they have to be able to retrieve it when they get into the deliberation room. So first, encoding is all about storytelling. And there's studies out there that talk about how to tell a story and make it more memorable. And so you gotta, put it into narrative form. You don't want to say, at 11:59, the defendant did this. At 12:02, he did this. And at 1:52, it's too many numbers. The jurors are going to get overwhelmed. They can't follow it. Instead say, around midnight, this happened. 5 minutes later, he did this. Roughly a half hour later, he did this. You want to tell it in a story format as opposed to like it would in a police report, because they're going to get overwhelmed with a bunch of numbers. So you just got to tell it like a story. Think about like Cinderella. It's a story that people remember, but if it was just the facts, it would be very boring and nobody would remember it. You want to have visuals to support. So if you can incorporate PowerPoint slides and data, all that stuff is going to help you tell your story better. And so you want to have a catchy intro to your case. I don't recommend that you stand up, I don't recommend doing this and say, my name is Christina Marinakis, I am proud to represent the state in this matter. We look forward to presenting our case to you for your opening statement. Let me tell you about what happened in this case. Not a great way of opening your state. You got to open with something strong. So most of my cases, actually here's a criminal one I can give you. So we had a case where I'm actually on the defendant's side and he was being charged with assault. Protesters came to his door at 5 o'clock in the morning, and he came down with a gun and pointed at them, and his wife is a pretty famous prosecutor, actually. So we're doing the defense of that, and the way we opened is going to say something like 5 in the morning, pitch black, no street lights. John Smith must go. The voices get louder. John Smith must go. My client wakes out from his sleep, a little disoriented. He hears it again. John Smith must go. Gets louder and louder. So he reaches the gun that he has under his bed, that he has just in case there's a home intruder. And his wife ran and called 911. She was so disoriented, she didn't even know her own address. And they were terrified. John Smith must go. These people were banging on their door at 5 o'clock in the morning in pitch black. That's the state of mind, ladies and gentlemen, that my client had when he answered the door holding the gun. He was scared. And he was acting in self-defense, and that's what this case is about. So let me tell you about the evidence. Let me take a step back. Sorry, my name is Christina Marinakis, and I'm proud to represent the defendant in this case. That's how you do an opening. You start by painting the picture and telling the story, and then you can do the whole, wait a minute, let me take a step back and introduce myself. Now, you got to make it so it's not argumentative, I get it, but got to capture their imagination, and so you can do that with a very catchy opening like that. You're also going to have a catchy outro. So this is one thing that I do actually, is I write intros and outros. I don't write whole openings, but I write intros and outros. We wrote the outro in the George Floyd case, and I don't know if any of you remember it, but it went something like, so one of the defense arguments was that George Floyd had an enlarged heart. I forget what it was called, the megacardialemia, something like that. So they were arguing that it had an enlarged heart, plus the drugs, plus the pressure. That's what actually contributed to his death. So our closing, the closing outro of that case was the defense said that Mr. Floyd died because his heart was too big. But the truth of the matter is that Mr. Floyd died because Mr. Chauvin's heart was too small. So have your intro, have your outro, like what is your mic drop moment, you know? And in the one with the gun case, our outro is something like, they're not the victims here. They got exactly what they wanted. It was filmed on social media because they wanted to disrupt the re-election of the district attorney. These plaintiffs it's a civil case, these plaintiffs, and a criminal, but these plaintiffs did not, they weren't scared. They got exactly what they wanted. Don't let them play the victim when they've been the puppeteer. And that's kind of like how we end. So always just end on like something catchy if you can come up with that. It makes it much more interesting. So this was actually, here it was. So George Takai here actually retweeted it. You were told that George Floyd died because his heart was too big. The reason is it was because Derek Chauvin's heart was too small. So people remember that stuff. It sticks. Encoding, again, goes to research on memory. Jurors and people, just in general, are more likely to remember alliterative phrases, phrases that have rhythm and rhyming, phrases that they're familiar with, and things that they have associations with. So you should think of themes as buckets of your case. If you have 5 themes, here's our 5 themes, every witness, every piece of evidence is going to go in that bucket. Because jurors will not remember every piece of evidence, but if they remember the bucket, they will remember the essence of that theme and the essence of that evidence, and that's what's going to stick in their heads. So they're like buckets. So use association as using your themes as buckets. Retrieval is about memory recall. There's short-term memory, long-term memory, and sensory memory. So short-term is all about impact. That's that intro and outro I said. You want to have impact on the jurors. That's what they're going to remember. The long-term is that association. So what I like to do is if you have a theme, put the theme as the header of your slide in your closing, or throughout, if you have an expert, or even if you're allowed to do it in an opening, and then put all the evidence that goes with that theme underneath. That way the juror remembers the theme, and then they remember the evidence. Next slide, theme header is the same. Now you've got testimony excerpts. So the theme is always going to be the same, but you've got different content within that. It's going to help the jurors bucket it together, and they're going to have that long-term association. And then repetition. Your theme should be repeated. You present them in opening. You have a witness, if you can get it across in witness testimony, and then you can then repeat it again in closing. So what makes a good theme? I mentioned earlier that alliteration helps with memory. Alliterative themes are what I think the best themes. I'd say probably 90% of my themes are alliterative. So I mentioned earlier, culture of callousness. This is from the Vanessa Bryant trial, where we were plaintiffs in that case against the county. And in that case, we had to prove that it wasn't just rogue officers who took pictures of the victims. We had to show that it was a pattern, practice, or procedure within the police department. That's the only way we could find liability under that act. So we came up with the theme of culture of callousness, that it was all about the culture there of the police department that fostered this, because they would have death books in their lockers where they would keep gross photos. They would have competitions among who could find the grossest photo. That was the culture of the police department. It's a culture of callousness. And so what did you see? Culture of callousness by the NBC News. Mentioned that in their first post in the tweet. This came from, I think, Law 360. Bryant crash pics part of the culture of callousness. This was from Bleacher Report. An attorney for Vanessa Bryant argued a culture of callousness. If reporters are reporting it, you can guarantee that jurors are going to be remembering it too. Pride over policing, also a theme from the George Floyd trial. He chose pride over policing, they say. This is on the Black Wall Street Times. CBS again said Derek Chauvin chose pride over policing, prosecutor says. People are now tweeting it, hashtag pride over policing. Themes work, these alliterative themes work because people remember them because they're catchy, and this is proof in the pudding. So other alliterative themes that I've just used in cases that you might be able to use something about science, not speculation. This case is about the science and the DNA evidence in this case. The science supports that, not speculation. This more civil case, but we use dose makes the difference. It might work in a case like maybe a DUI case. Dose makes the difference. Data, not deception. The prosecution has brought you data here, and what the defense has brought is deception. This case is about facts, not feelings. This is a really good one if you've got a sympathetic defendant. We need you all to decide the case based on your facts, not feelings of sympathy that you may have towards the defendant. Also, rhyming and rhythm. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. So everyone kind of remembers that one. Why? Because it's catchy. Everybody remembers it. I've used this in a case. A deal with Pence doesn't make sense. It sounds cheesy. You can't do it in every case. All right. So some cases you can't do it because it's just too cheesy. But there's other cases where you might be able to do something like that, and you'll get a little chuckle from the jurors, but they're going to remember it. Even just rhythm. It doesn't have to rhyme, but rhythm. People actually are more likely to remember things that come in threes. They like things. I don't know why, but people like things in threes. It's like a rhythm to it. We learned our ABCs to rhythm, so rhythm and song is how we remember things. So you might use, this case is about context, consistency, and credibility. So when you look at this evidence, look at it, is it in context? Is the testimony consistent? Is the defendant's witnesses credible? And then another one, this is again rhythm, reviewed, approved, and discussed. And this actually was also quoted in the newspaper. This was a case involving a conversion. It was a conversion trial. And they said that no, they knew what they were paying for, and everything was reviewed, approved, and discussed by the council. So again, it was quoted in the newspaper there. And familiarity. People like colloquial phrases. With great, with great honor comes with great power comes great responsibility. Something like that. People know those phrases. So in this one, we use, they knew what they were paying for, or they got what they paid for. That's a common phrase. So this was, they knew what they were paying for. And there it is. With great power comes great responsibility. I do civil cases. For a truck, an 18-wheeler can't stop on a dime. That's a great theme for trucking cases. And so we do focus groups to get themes. And I know you don't have the budget to do focus groups, maybe with like we do, but get your people in the office together and who's got some ideas here? What are some potential themes? And just start whiteboarding. And people just come up with some really creative ideas. So that's actually how we got our pride over policing theme. When we mocked that case with mock jurors, we did a focus group and a mock trial. And we talk about this now. It's actually the Attorney General put this in his book. We did a focus group, and the jurors came back and they said, yes for manslaughter, but no for murder, most of the jurors said. And we were like, why? Why did you feel that way? And they just said there was no motive. Like, you didn't prove a motive. What motive would Derek Chauvin have to do this, to make it murder? They didn't know each other. I know there's some rumors out there they worked the same place. They never worked there at the same time. There's no evidence they ever knew each other. So it was like motive. So we said, so what was the motive? What do you think the motive was? And one of our prosecution jurors said, it was pride. He saw all those people here who he saw as being lesser than him because they were in a poor community. He saw those people as lesser, and he was too proudful to listen to what they had to say when they said, get up, get your knee off his neck. It was pride over policing, and it came straight from one of those mock jurors' mouth, became the theme that ended up being echoed around the world. Incorporating themes, I say introduce them in opening. I think I mentioned this before, put them as the headers of your slide. If you can get them to adopt your witnesses, if you're able to do any type of witness work or practice with your witness, they can get them to practice by incorporating some of those themes. Or you can even get the opponents to say that, if you can get them to admit some of those things. Like, you would agree that an 18-wheeler can't stop on a dime, right? You can get them to agree to some of those things. So you can get admissions on cross sometimes, and then you can repeat then your themes in closing. I also like to bookend your argument. So it means, like, start with your theme. This case is about pride over policing. Then talk about how he was too prideful, blah, blah, blah. And in the end, Mr. Chauvin put pride over policing. So you're going to bookend your argument with your themes. All right, so that's my little discussion on themes, and I think that's all I got. But if you have other questions, I'm happy to talk more. Thanks, guys. I have a very unique name, so I think you all have my name. It was on the flyer or something. If you Google me, you will find me. I did just change firms, so I'm not with the other firm, so don't email Expert Services. Email, it's christina.marinakis@immersionlegal.com. But I will be announcing that soon, so I'll have my LinkedIn. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to send you the book, or if I send one to the office, we can circulate it. Maybe that's easier, if you like it. All right, yeah, okay, we'll do that. Then we don't have to.